Happy New Year. And surprise, I'm not Peter. So just a really quick explanation as to what's going to happen today. Unfortunately, Peter has been called by the ministry for a really urgent meeting. It's only going to be half an hour. So with the wonders of technology and asynchronous learning, we have asked Peter to pre-record his presentation. So for the first bit, you will see Peter presenting what he was intending to present. He will join us at around 12:30 to answer questions, and so we can have much more of a dialogue and continue that discussion. So our apologies that he won't be here for the first half, but he will be here as previously committed. So most of you will know Peter already from a lot of the work that you do with us, but just in case, so Dr. Selby he's the executive director of TEACH. He is the principal investigator of the STOP program. So a lot of you will be familiar with both of, well, you'll know TEACH for sure. And he does a lot of work in tobacco cessation, but also vaping cessation. We have several projects on the go with vaping, and Peter's the lead of all of those projects. So I'm not going to delay further. I am going to now hand it off to the admin team, who will walk you through the slides. And one thing that I will ask is that we will monitor your questions, but if you can not post your questions until Peter joins, then it'll be a little bit easier to just monitor some of the questions that come through. So just hold on as long as you can. Then once Peter's joined, feel free to post, but our team is online and they'll monitor the chat anyway, just in case. Okay, so hope you enjoy the presentation, and I will now mute myself so you can hear Peter's voice.
Hi, everybody. Surprise, I'm not live for this one. I will be joining you at halfway through to answer the questions. I had to skip away for a meeting, so I'm just recording, and I hope this works. So these are TEACH educational rounds. The title today is a Vaping Update, Products, Practices, and Properties. And as you know, I'm Dr. Peter Selby. And before I go any further, I want to thank all of you who are continuing to work at the front lines and seeing patients. And many of you have continued to operationalize STOP and help people who are also addicted to tobacco try to stop and reduce their risk of developing really bad COVID or getting hospitalized. And so thank you very much. And all of us here at the Nicotine Dependent Services in Toronto, thank you for your continued participation. And work with people who smoke. With some of the administrative aspects of this, if you want to get a letter of completion for these rounds, make sure you're registered for the webinar and you've completed the pre-learning assessment. Sign in to view and participate in the live webinar session using your first and last name, and then please complete the evaluation and post-learning assessment. As you know, these webinars are being live tweeted, and you can follow us at our Twitter handle @PSQuitSmoking. If you want to follow the live tweeting or to post questions or comments using Twitter, you can use the TEACH webinar hashtag, which is at the top of this slide. This is my biography. My disclosures, I've got lots of grant support from non-commercial support. Pretty much the only commercial support I have is an investigator-initiated grant as a co-investigator from the grant program, which is funded by Pfizer. And for nothing relevant to these rounds today, but as you all know, STOP buys nicotine replacement at a discount from the two manufacturers of nicotine replacement in Canada, Johnson & Johnson and Novartis. No tobacco, vaping, or alcohol industry funding. What are my disclosures? The potential sources of bias outlined on the previous slide have been mitigated by using evidence-based research and making this information accessible and available to all participants. These are our usual teach curriculum development slide, and clearly we are guideline-based, evidence-based, and we do not get influenced or funded by any tobacco industry or pharmaceutical industry in the development of the information, and it's peer-reviewed and it's accredited for the most part for the rounds and for the core course of teach. So we make sure that what we are giving is a unbiased and information about the evidence. So we have 4 learning objectives today. One is investigating the evolution of vaping products and why this matters today. It's an update from some of the previous ones we've talked about. Evaluate youth vaping and explore how do we advise them, given we really want to prevent the next generation from getting addicted to nicotine. Analyze adult vaping as a method of smoking cessation. So we do think vaping, and I do think vaping has a potential role to help adult smokers who quit smoking cigarettes, combustible cigarettes, and replace them completely. But there are some nuances there. And lastly, we want to talk about the emergent low-risk nicotine use guidelines. So what do we want to do first? I want to investigate the evolution of these products and why this matters. You know, 2007 was the first product that came out of China. And they were called cigarettes. They looked like cigarettes. They're more plasticky and shiny, as you can see, of different colors. They were rechargeable or disposable. And they didn't have any they couldn't be adjusted. You couldn't adjust the power setting. And the second generation came fairly quickly in 3 years, where they looked like pens or pagers. Battery was strengthened to be last longer and to also generate a higher voltage. And they were refillable and had larger cartridges, and the flavors and nicotine concentration started going up in them. And then, about 6 to 7 years ago, we started seeing what are known as mods and customizable, where the power could be customized, the voltage could be customized, the airflow could be customized. They were refillable, and there was a larger cartridge. So these look like really much bigger devices, and gained a lot of popularity. And then after that, with the continued evolution, we started seeing what are known as jewels, which made it most popular. But they look like pen drives, but they are pod-based systems. And I'll review them in the next slide. That Joule is just one of them, which is most popular, but there are many different types of pod-based systems out there and brands, and they be manufactured all over the world, mostly in China. But the difference is they come into 2 types. One of the closed pod systems, which you cannot modify, and you use the cartridge, and when you're finished with the cartridge, you replace the cartridge. And then you have the open pod systems, where there are replaceable liquids, and that is where the dangers can also come in, when you can allow people to replace the liquids that they're using. So the big, why did these become so popular? Is because they are, for the very reason they were developed to help the highly addicted smoker to switch. They also, through its marketing, actually was appealing to young people who've never tried it and took this up in a big way. So what allowed that to happen? So yes, in addition to the marketing, what was different was this had something known as nicotine salts, typically nicotine citrate. But what that means is the nicotine salt with the vapor can actually reach the terminal alveoli. And when it can reach the terminal alveoli, it dissociates from that back into the freebase and gets absorbed. So compared to other systems where most of the nicotine is so harsh, you couldn't go past much of the upper parts of the lower parts of the upper airways or the early parts of the lung. It couldn't really get down deep into the lung. This solved for that problem. And people with the high concentration, people got an immediate rush, which obviously made it feel good. But on the downside, it disappeared quickly. And so people started needing to use more and more of it. This nicotine salts can do well with lower power devices, which is a good thing because the lower the power, the less likely you're creating products of combustion or getting close to products of combustion and creating, for example, acetaldehyde and formaldehyde, things that are really toxic. Hopefully, by having a lower temperature, you're not necessarily going to need to get to those high temperatures that can lead to the creation of some of those products. On the other hand, it's not safe in the sub-ohm devices, and basically the overall issue is, as I mentioned, because of all these factors, it's a much smoother vaping experience than with some of the other vaping devices. And the other thing that comes with it is a lower production of vape that is external. You can, some of them can be adjusted so that you get more of a cloud, but for the most part, this can be pretty discreet. The downside is it made it easy to use in schools, etc. And we saw that coming up where young people were using vaping devices in their schools, in the bathrooms, and schools had to have take action to address some of those problems. But in general, when we look at products overall, from all the products on the market, clearly, first generation are probably just novelty products only found in the convenience store and left over from way before, and I don't even know if they manufacture them anymore. But in general, people, if they are making that choice to get a vaping device, look for second generation or higher. Buy it from a vape store rather than just a convenience store and get educated. Be careful about buying what's known as a heat not burn versus a true vaping device. There are heat not burn devices, which are basically tobacco which are heated, and those are manufactured by the tobacco industry. They are clearly create less toxins than a cigarette, but not as low as a vaping device where nicotine is being delivered as opposed to tobacco. So clearly make sure that they're buying the right product and not buying an ecosystem or systems that are sold by the tobacco industry. Of course, it becomes much harder because of COVID and things being shut down. They're buying it on the internet and having things delivered. But again, to be mindful of what they're getting. Clearly use closed pod systems with no flavors, or at least only tobacco flavors, and avoid, we've covered this before, that some of the risks with flavoring is there, so to avoid those flavors. But there is a risk that as people start using vaping devices, they move with a tobacco flavor, they gradually start trying to and start using the ones which have flavors. So one has to be mindful about that. They should also know to understand the device fully, understand how they replace or keep the coils clean in those that do have coils, and replace the parts as per the instructions, including the wick as needed, because these things can get degrade and can cause more harm. So people need to keep them clean. And clearly charge the device with the charger that comes with it, and be careful because there has been risk of explosions, etc. One of the things that I like to make sure that people also understand is where they buy their vape juices, also from a reputable, by the same brand. These are legal in Canada now, and but the levels of regulation are not pharmaceutical grade. It's somewhere like in between. So it's still a bit of buyer beware, but generally, buy it from a reputable source, whatever that might be. So what about youth vaping, and how do we advise young people who come to us clinically about their use of vaping device. So Canadian studies and surveys in the CSTADS 2019, which is the Canadian Student Tobacco and Alcohol Drug Survey for youth grades 7 to 12, e-cigarette prevalence rates were 20% of students who have used in the past 30 days. And this is a trend going up, double since the last survey in 2016, 17. And static or lower levels of combustible cigarette use in the UK and in the US amongst young people, this switchover is not completely benign, and we need to understand that before we just go behind it and promote it as the way to get cigarette prevalence down, because there are some material issues that we need to consider. So when you take a look at students who use a vaping product in the past 30 days, 90% used a product with nicotine. Of those who vape, 40% are vaping daily. And we need to pay attention to this group, because had we gone on without these products, the low prevalence of tobacco amongst young people, delaying exposure to nicotine to beyond 21, or in 1921, etc., would have been a reality. And as we know, most of the drop in prevalence in smoking in Canada is mostly attributable because most people haven't smoked. So we have to keep that going, and we need to understand how vaping may be double-edged in the sense, if it's bringing in more people, getting them addicted to nicotine and then getting them to switch to cigarettes, we need to figure out a way to prevent that from happening. So what do you think about vaping? This is what their perceptions are. 42% think vaping regularly with nicotine poses great risk of harm. 32% thought moderate risk, and 6% no harm. 14% thought vaping regularly without nicotine poses great risk, and 27% a moderate risk. What do we tell young people? Clearly, we need to educate them if they're using. But one thing I've learned is ask them what they know about e-cigarettes and vaping, and what is their use pattern. Is it, how are they using it? Is it occasional? Is it daily? Are they waking up at night? First thing in the morning, they can't go without their vapes. There's, getting more signs of addiction developing versus when they used to be out with their buddies, they're vaping. Now, of course, with COVID, nobody's going anywhere to socialize. And so, but how are they doing that now? And how are they sourcing it? How are they getting it? Are they getting it, in the mail? Are they hiding it from their parents, etc.? So how is this happening? The other one is, making sure that they understand the health risks with e-cigarette use or vaping, and the lack of evidence, and the knowledge about the long-term effects of these products. Now, of course, many young people cannot appreciate the long-term consequences, but I think if we have a informed discussion, at least that information can be exchanged, and using more of an asking rather than a telling kind of dialogue can get that message across. Explore with them the development of symptoms of addiction. Craving, getting withdrawal symptoms, developing tolerance, being preoccupied with using it, hiding and secretive use, etc. All of that are indications that the person is beginning to get addicted, and so certainly, talk about that. And also talk about and explore with them if they ever experience any withdrawal, if they stop suddenly. Do they end up getting irritable, anxious, unable to focus, hungry, agitated, etc. All the symptoms of nicotine withdrawal, that develop within hours to days of stopping, and reverse as soon as they go back to using. So it's important to have that conversation with them, because they may not recognize that they're developing an addiction. They may say, I'm anxious and I vape and my anxiety goes away, but all they may be doing is getting rid of nicotine withdrawal. So getting that education, helping them understand what's going on is critical. Now, coming back to adults, is it a good method of smoking cessation? And what will we say to somebody who asks us, I want to use an e-cigarette to quit, or I feel addicted to e-cigarettes, what do I do? So both things come up right now in our clinic. Is this. So what does the evidence suggest? So if you take a look at this large systematic review of 50 studies from 13 countries, where you look at electronic cigarettes for smoking cessation, what is the efficacy and safety of using them to help people who smoke achieve long-term smoking abstinence? They came out with a moderate quality evidence that nicotine e-cigarettes help people quit more than nicotine replacement and non-nicotine e-cigarettes. So they are really favoring that. And in the UK, where the Cochrane Collaborative is mostly based, the NHS has this on their formulary, and they pay for it for people who are trying to quit. And it's the most popular format that people are choosing to use to quit, compared to nicotine replacement or varenicline or bupropion. Our colleagues in Montreal, Dr. Eisenberg, did a national study and published it in 2020 this year, so it's fresh off the press. These are 376 Canadian adults who were motivated to quit. Enrolled them over 2016 to 2019. They terminated the study early because of product issues, the e-cigarette product itself, and that's a problem with all these studies. That the products that are being used, even in the products that are used in the studies, sometimes they disappear from the market halfway through the study. But in the study, they randomized people to nicotine e-cigarettes, non-nicotine e-cigarettes, or no e-cigarettes. So these three groups, but all groups receive counseling. So when you look at the smoking cessation outcome of point prevalent absence, which means usually not having a single puff for 7 continuous days at any time point, you'll end up seeing that it's greater for e-cigarettes with e-cigarettes plus counseling versus counseling alone at 12 weeks. But there was also a significant quit for non-nicotine e-cigarettes at 24 weeks, and it's not clear why that is the case. Don't know, but speculating that it's possible that these non-nicotine e-cigarettes at 24 weeks are satisfying some other aspect of the addiction that is more dominant at that time point, and that helps the person stay away. And it's not really the nicotine at that point that is required. So the non-nicotine cigarette may be, is continuing to be used because it provides something for the sensory motor aspects and the hand, but they're not getting exposed to nicotine. So lots to consider there. But it's a good time to review the public health message from England. It's a bit old now, but all of it had not been discarded. I mean, they said e-cigarettes are safer than smoking by 95%, and everybody jumped on that. The truth is probably somewhere, maybe a little lower, but it doesn't matter. But pay attention to the other recommendations. And the other recommendations and messages were really our key ones in a harm reduction paradigm. And I think in Canada, where we are exploring harm reduction for a whole host of conditions and other addictions, it seems odd to me that we aren't much more advanced in our harm reduction efforts when it comes to tobacco and nicotine exposure. So clearly this idea from unsuccessful quitters may be encouraged to use e-cigarettes makes sense. Behavioral support should be provided. So they're also going with the evidence that, look, it's not just about making it available in the store and that's it. You provide people behavioral support, how to use it, how not to get overly dependent on it, how to come off it, etc. And we do have patients who come who want to get off their e-cigarettes, and young people too, feeling very addicted to them and want to come off. And so how do you help those people? And the literature is sparse of what to do for them. So behavioral support has been one way to help people who feel addicted to e-cigarettes come off it. But we've been using standard nicotine replacement therapies. We've been using Varenicline and all the other approved medications for smoking cessation to help this population quit, including tapering the concentration of nicotine that they may be getting in their vaping device, knowing that it's a bit of a hit and miss. But so those are some of the ways in which we've helped people. But the behavioral support is pretty similar to that which we provide with cigarettes. So that's a critical one. Unmotivated smokers may report a decline in smoking-related diseases by using e-cigarettes, and there's some emerging evidence that those with COPD and asthma, if they switch completely, they don't get as many exacerbations as if they stay the smoker. So these are early days and early studies and not definitive, but there is some evidence that by reducing that exposure, you're reducing the risks and harms. There's also the idea that by switching over, people can reduce their cigarette use, and therefore that leads them onto a trajectory of cessation, as long as they don't sort of make that decision to be dual users for life, where they say, I'll smoke when I can and I'll vape when I can't smoke. So those tend not to do as well. They tend not to feel as addicted to their devices, but also they may not be getting the benefit by then completely switching over to e-cigarettes. Generally, if you use e-cigarettes as intended, people don't get nicotine poisoning, but generally with the pod-based systems, because some of them have really high concentrations, like 56 milligrams of nicotine, and those regulations for limiting the amount of nicotine are just coming in sporadically in the country. You can have people who get sick from nicotine, and nicotine poisoning often is involved with, feeling really nauseous, queasy, vomiting, lightheaded, having a headache, feeling like you're going to pass out, pulse goes down, you feel awful, and you may get, you may need to get to the emergency room. But for by and large, if people are saying periodically they're getting into that state, then let them know that those are symptoms of poisoning, and they should probably not use those vaping devices in that way. And we talked about e-cigarettes being safer than smoking. How much safer is still debatable, but it's not just a few percentage safer. It's an order of magnitude likely safer. By anybody will tell you from what exposures you get, and we've presented this before. What exposures you get, from a e-cigarette compared to what you get from a regular cigarette is just orders of magnitude that much lower. So we need to be honest about that and let people know that and make an informed choice. Ensure that products are safe and children protected, and these are regulatory issues. And clearly, people should know that they should not leave their juice lying around for children as well as pets. And more research is necessary with vaping devices, but Canada has dropped the ball. It's impossible for us to do research on these products and in any experimental way to either prove that they can be used for cessation or not, because one, the regulatory environment just does not allow us, and we are so dependent on a manufacturer to do all the heavy lifting with Health Canada and treat it like a medication, which is impossible. So, and this is a similar thing happened with legalization of cannabis. Can't do any studies with the products for medical purposes because you have to go through all these regulatory hoops, and you can't get the approval to do the studies. So these products are available, but Canadians cannot study them to tell us whether they're safe for Canadians, which is ludicrous. But that's where we are. So with that in mind and the landscape, how do we develop lower risk guidelines? And this is what I want to round up my talk with today, is that we got some funding from Health Canada's SUAP program in 2019, and we pulled together members from across Canada I'm not going to go into all the details because this is just giving you a preliminary view of what's happening, and I'm not going into all the methodologies that we did, but we will present at a later date. But just wanted to tell you what has come from that. And we had a 2-day meeting for the creation of the guidelines in November 2019. Which seems such a long time ago. We actually did that in person, which was nice. But since then, we've been working and developing these draft guidelines for all the approval processes that they have to go through, and have come up with a title known as the lower risk nicotine use guidelines, similar to our lower risk cannabis use guidelines and lower risk alcohol consumption guidelines. So these are the domains we talked about. Addiction. So let's take a look about addiction. And one way is in this recommendation is use of e-cigarettes with nicotine should be discouraged amongst non-smokers due to the risk of addiction. And that's pretty common sense. And we have to make sure that this is discouraged not only by telling people, but also by having policy things in place so that people don't land up getting addicted. We also said, as part of that, there is substantial evidence that e-cigarettes with nicotine are addictive, and people will display symptoms of addiction and dependence if they use nicotine-containing e-cigarettes. Also, the observations are that e-cigarette use increases the risk of ever using combustible tobacco amongst youth and young adults. However, transition to regular use of tobacco cigarettes is unclear at this time. And it could be that there's some third factor that accounts for why kids, these young people, use vaping devices, use cigarettes, because the studies show that they also use cannabis, they drink alcohol, and they may have other conditions going on. So we can't make a causative link, but clearly it's an indication we should be looking at that young person more closely and see what else is going on in their life before they go from vaping into becoming a regular cigarette. With respect to the high-dose nicotine salts, they may increase the risk of addiction, and clearly this is something for us to understand, is to use lower concentrations of the nicotine salts. So the idea of the 20 milligram per mil regulatory sort of requirement that is in Europe, for example, may be a good way to prevent this uptake of high-dose nicotine salts, because we don't see vaping in youth the way in the UK compared to what we see in Canada and the US. So, and in that jurisdiction, there are some restrictions about how it's been promoted and what the concentrations are and what people should use for what purpose. So there are certain things that we can do to prevent people from getting addicted. At the individual level, we should let people know that these are addictive and that the nicotine addiction may increase their risk of switching to combustible tobacco cigarettes, and they should definitely not do that, because you're going from overall less exposure to high exposure from tobacco cigarettes. And so explore that if they are deciding to switch over to tobacco cigarettes, what's that about? Patients should be advised to restrict the use of e-cigarettes to protect non-users from airborne particulate matter. So therefore, people should vape outdoors and not indoors. We then looked at the construct of cessation. So what are the recommendations for cessation? E-cigarettes with nicotine may be an effective cessation aid for people who use combustible tobacco. And we've discussed that evidence before, so I'm not spend too much time on that. But clearly, one of the recommendations is to use if you are using it to quit, then use the e-cigarette more regularly than just occasionally. And so I clinically, I'll tell people who are using an e-cigarette to quit smoking and switch over completely is every time you get a craving, then as you would go outside to have that cigarette, take your vaping device and use it in the same way outdoors, because what you don't want them to do is become grazers of the e-cigarette through the day, having it in their mouth and just puffing in it And the other thing is to tell them to only puff till they feel comfortable. As opposed to a cigarette that people always feel they need to complete it with and they have that cue of having finished the cigarette. We know from studies, brain imaging studies, that after 3 puffs, you've pretty much saturated all the receptors in your brain. When you're using an e-cigarette, you have no idea how much, whether you're done or not. And so it's important to be really mindful. And so I often will tell my patients to take a puff at the e-cigarette and then see if they need the next one and only take the ones that they need and till they feel full. And so be really mindful of that activity and then stop and go back to whatever they were doing. Try not to let vaping get conditioned to what cigarettes were conditioned to. So don't let it become mindless in a sense. The other one that we came up with is people who use combustible nicotine products should try to quit with approved medications. Absolutely. And they should do this first. I mean, there's no doubt about it. We should use evidence-based treatments first. Having said that, if they're unable or unwilling, then e-cigarettes could be considered. But again, given the Canadian landscape, at best we can educate people about it, but we can't recommend a particular product by name with a prescription at this stage because they haven't gotten approval for that. The other thing to consider is that if you are going to use it for cessation, let them know that getting counseling with it makes it more likely to be effective. They should be switching completely, as we talked about, not going to dual use. They can use whichever device they wish to use, but be really careful about the ones that they can modify and they can add substances to, because that's the problem with some of the lung injuries that we have seen in the last few years, and that's a concern. And again, letting them know that in the short term, switching completely will significantly reduce the harms, but long term is unknown. And that's just honest. We just don't know. It could be fine, but we just don't know in the long term. And the last thing is continued use of e-cigarettes may reduce risk of relapse to combustible tobacco, because in the Hayek study, that's what they found. And 1 year out, those who had stopped tended to be continuous users of e-cigarettes. So people are using it to prevent relapse. And finally, we paid attention to health outcomes. So this is part of the prevention message. People who do not use any tobacco products should not use e-cigarettes. And clearly, this is a clear message for young people about not getting addicted. People who are currently using e-cigarettes should stop or switch to a safer form of nicotine, such as NRT. So if we've got somebody who's heavily dependent on e-cigarette, is really quit cigarettes completely. Have that discussion of using if they're willing to quit nicotine completely, then obviously there's some of the other treatments we have off-label, like varenicline or bupropion or a combination thereof. Or if they're just wanting to switch to a safer form of nicotine, go to the patch, go to the lozenge, go to the inhaler, go to the mouth spray, because you're basically going to be protecting your lungs when you switch to this other format of nicotine intake. Factual thing you can tell people is that if they do switch from a combustible tobacco to e-cigarettes, they will reduce their exposure to numerous toxicants and carcinogens. There's no doubt about that, and the order of magnitude is large. Also, they should understand that if they are unable or unwilling to quit by other means, including cold turkey, e-cigarettes may be a lower risk alternative overall that can get them some benefit, but the exact amount of benefit at this point is unknown. As you know, when people quit smoking cigarettes, within the first year, you get most of your benefit, 50%, half your risk of having a heart attack, and it continues to get better the longer and longer you go. But it can take up to 10 years before your risk from lung cancer drops down significantly, and maybe even longer for strokes, etc. So even if people switch over to e-cigarettes and then they have an event, it's important for them to understand that this could be because they were, the effects of cigarettes have continued to play out. The other issues is that the long-term health effects of e-cigarette use are unknown. There's some evidence of what is known as mutagenesis and DNA damage that can be related to e-cigarette use by itself. That is a marker for increased cancer risk. And clearly, this is again the reason why non-smokers should not be vaping. And there's evidence that they get local irritation, cough, mouth and throat irritation, dryness, etc. As we said, it's really important for people to understand that they are less harmful than combustible tobacco, but are not completely harmless. So this is not something we should be promoting for youth and non-smokers as something to be to engage in. And again, it's because they do contain and emit substances with unknown harms when inhaled. And of course, if they are going to use them, get instructions on how to use them and keep them clean, and when to replace and which parts as well. If direct advice to people is clearly getting people to understand that they should not purchase these from illicit or black market sources. Do not adulterate or modify the product by adding THC, for example, or vitamin E acid, containing products, which has been associated in many of the cases of what's known as EVALI, e-cigarette or vaping associated lung injuries, and do not modify the device in any way. Obviously, keep the products, especially the juices, away from children. And we don't really know what the additional risk from e-cigarettes and combustible tobacco at the same time is worse, but you do know that these people are getting higher exposures to nicotine at least.
All right, everyone. So Peter has now joined us. So we've gathered a few questions that people shared throughout the presentation. But if people would like to share any questions that they may have, feel free to do so in the chat box now. Thanks so much.
The team and everyone for accommodating my request to go off to a meeting that I couldn't get out of. And I apologize for the noise in the back. I'm at the hospital, so you're going to hear testing of codes. So I'm going to just go through some of the questions that I've got in the chat that Megan, who is keeping track, forwarded to me. So and I'm not sure who said these questions, so I apologize, but I'm just going to answer them. One is the amount of nicotine delivered equal to the amount of nicotine put into the vaping device? And that's a question. I mean, certainly with the amount of nicotine that's in the liquid is never amount that's delivered and never that's absorbed. And often you will see that, if you take a look at the amount of nicotine actually in a tobacco cigarette or in a nicotine replacement product, with the cigarette, the products of combustion, suddenly a lot of it gets degraded, but there's often enough to deliver at least 1 milligram from that cigarette, even though on average, although the cigarette itself may have 10 milligrams. If you take a look at a patch and look at how much nicotine there is, it's in the, I think 21 milligram patch has some close to 100 milligrams or something or more, but only 21 milligrams gets absorbed. So similarly with vaping devices, you're going to have a higher concentration, but how much actually gets absorbed is variable, but that's a good question. So they have been, so here's the thing, the question is, if e-cigarettes have been around since 2007, how come the prevalence of smoking has not gone down? And here's the issue is, generally, if you take a look at the prevalence of any condition, it's how many new users are coming and how many existing users continue. So if we don't drop the number of existing users down, you're not going to get a reduction in prevalence. And existing users have not in any large part switched over 100% over to vaping. Most of the vaping market that we're seeing is coming from young people getting into it who should never have got into it in the first place. So in the US and in the UK and in places where vaping has gone up, you are seeing a reduction in onset of youth smoking, and we've seen some of that in Canada. How much of that is attributable to vaping itself is debatable. There have been other issues going on, but we do know that to drop prevalence, there's the traditional things that are required. Price is an important one. Overall, if you look at cigarettes right now, relatively, they are overall cheaper than they were 10 years ago. So we need to continue to keep that price and taxation going up. Those are the things that make a difference. And we need to continue to reduce the supply of cigarettes and have options for those who are quitting to go. So it's a great question. And I think, there's a lot of confusion. If you create confusion in the population, where even scientists can agree that it's a safer option to move to, then people don't go, or they'll try it and they say it's not good enough. And if you really want the population to move completely, you got to make it easier to use safer devices like vaping devices and harder to use cigarettes. So they cannot have an equivalent approach to it. So, and why are companies not going for the approval? Because look, if you can sell a product, you're a commercial entity, you can sell a product with the minimum amount of investment. Why would you try to get a medical approval for it? Because you're close to, first of all, it's risky. Secondly, you're going to have to put up a lot of research money. First, you have to show safety in animals, then you have to show a whole bunch of research that will go not only for the e-liquid, for example, but also for the device. And if my other option is I can sell it without making a claim, no problem, then why would I spend that money? And that's the same reason with some of the medical cannabis and others, is that people aren't putting that money that is required to do the studies. And we really need a different kind of way to regulate and study these innovations like vaping devices. But there isn't the appetite, the political and bureaucratic appetite to actually have a pragmatic approach like they have in the UK. Hearing a lot of red herrings about banning flavors or moving back. Now, banning flavors, really the flavors issues really brings in young people and kids in. And I think we do need to think about those flavors. And secondly, flavors generally weren't meant to be inhaled. So what are the impact? And those, flavors are chemicals and compounds, right? Whether they're natural or whether they're extracted naturally or they come from, made in a factory, they are chemicals. And what is flavors, typically we eat them, we don't inhale them. So although some people say they inhale their food, that's a different matter. But a flavor is really something to be mindful of, and you have to be careful about this. So flavorants, we need to look at them as an additive, and we need to study their safety and whether they are there. The issue is, till fairly recently, big tobacco had no role in vaping devices. They've obviously brought out the heat not burn device, but mostly the vaping market prior to Juul being sold was actually by people independent of the tobacco industry per se. And now it's gone a bit murky as tobacco industry itself is now owning some of these things. So we don't know whether they bought it out to really have a good option to move everything out to vaping, or they bought it out to kill that industry, or basically hedge their bets. So it's all over the place. And then the other question that came up is someone COVID positive? Does the act of vaping pose risk for COVID transmission from the exhaled vape? Public Health Ontario has come out with some great documents, and I'm sure we can share them in the chat. I don't know if any of my team can go to the Public Health Ontario and look at vaping and COVID. And so here's the thing. When you exhale and you exhale forcefully, that is known to aerosolize a lot of things in your lungs, COVID included. So why would it not? Have the studies been done? I'm not aware of the study per se that has identified, COVID, SARS, SARS-2 on viruses in vaping aerosols that have been exhaled. I can't show that, but in essence, when people are vaping, they've taken off their masks. They're doing this, and certainly, if they're doing it indoors, they're going to create an aerosol. And I don't know if you've ever been to a vaping expo, but you'll get these huge clouds of aerosol just hanging in the air because that's what gets generated when people exhale. What we don't know is, for example, with some of the pod-based systems, you don't get as much as a cloud, and you don't necessarily see the same level of dense cloud forming. But overall, the current recommendation is that vaping, the aerosols might be carrying the virus, and it's not a good idea for people to be vaping indoors regardless. And again, do vape shop owners and training? I mean, we had initially suggested that there should be, just like the Smart Serve and other kinds of trainings that are offered, that there should be, something that anybody who's selling a vaping device should have some training about who they sell it. Of course, they have to do ID checks, but more than that is making sure that there's a conversation. But on the other hand, it's unrealistic to expect people who are in it for profit to have counsel people not to use the products that they are selling, because that means they've lost a sale. So, so how do we, so there is no mandate for them to do that. But it would be important. Okay. So I think I've got to all the questions that came before, but I'm going to make sure. How are we doing for time? We've got about 5 or 6 minutes left.
So yeah, Peter, I was just going to say there's quite a few questions in the chat. If you want to answer anything you feel like, and then I was going to say what we could do is keep some of those questions, and then maybe if you had any answers following the session, we could send that out to participants. Testing.
Okay. So do you anticipate the guidelines will look similar to in terms of delaying use until after 25? I mean, generally, we didn't get into that. We want to have delayed use after age 21 with cigarettes, but we didn't get into that, if I remember correctly. What would you advise me for people using cannabis or CBD oil in a vaping device? The answer would be that overwhelmingly say no, because the way THC has to be extracted, it's usually a butane extraction, which is in and of itself a dangerous extraction, and then it creates this oil that can be vaped. So, and again, vaping oil into your lungs is not a good idea. It is it's an irritant. And then if some entrepreneur adds vitamin E acetate to it, which has been thought to be the main reason why people end up with this valley, then it is really not a good idea. I mean, so far we've been saying for people who want to quit smoking cannabis, if they don't want to use the edibles, then use a vaporizer of the dried herb as opposed to a vaping device. Although many young people who want to hide it will use that. And again, we have to be a little careful because people sometimes don't know that this is really dangerous and really should not be vaping cannabis. Okay. All right. When are we going to? We are hopefully soon. And what about tapering the dose in the e-cigarettes if someone wants to quit vaping? How much should they reduce each time? Number of milligrams or ml, and the number of days between reducing steps. So the way, in general, the principle is this. So first of all, it's, there is nothing much quality control. I mean, we don't know if something says 20 milligrams per mil. Is it actually 20 milligrams per mil? And within the same company, if you buy the batch on Monday, is it similar to the batch that was produced on Friday? We have no idea. So having said that, in general, what we tell people to do is whatever they're using. First of all, as you know, nicotine is light sensitive, so that's why the vaping juice comes in dark bottles. Is that it can degrade with light. So start. If you're tapering, nicotine has a half-life. Basically, 50% of it goes off in a couple of hours. So within 5 half-lives, you pretty much eliminated all of it. And if you basically drop more than 10% of whatever you're taking at any given point in time, you will perceive it. If you drop by less than 10%, any substance, you don't tend to perceive it. So if they're tapering, I often tell them, taper the volume, because we have no idea what milligrams they're using. So use the volume and just taper by 10%. And you can taper by 10% every day and hold off as soon as you're finding yourself, compensating by having more sessions or going through more of the liquid. So, but basically, if they're measuring out their liquid for the day, reduce it by 10% per day should be enough, because in general, that could help them. And then switch to the lower concentration, especially if they're using a pod-based device, to switch from the 5% or the 3% and to the 1% to the 0. So, but availability can vary. So you really got to ask them to work with their shop where they go and get it, to know what are the strengths that they have available there. And of course, now with COVID, it's all online. So you got to figure out what they're doing. And that's how they should do it. And the idea is to prevent any kind of withdrawal symptoms emerging. Understanding that then helping them understand that if they've gone over to the placebo, that it is primarily the hand-mouth issues and the sensory issues that is driving the use. And so ways to counter that might be necessary as well. So it's not so much the nicotine as you taper them down. This cloudy with melatonin and essential oils addiction. Again, the answer is no. No oil should be going into your lungs, please. In general, humans should not be inhaling oils. Oils create a lipoid pneumonia. They're bad. They're very irritating. Your lung has no way to get rid of oil, so it'll create a reaction, an inflammatory reaction. So, in general, people should be discouraged from for their lung health, inhaling any vaporized form of oil. Interestingly enough, including incense sticks and candles are not necessarily good for you as well, especially if they're done excessively. And again, there is no way to do a translating a number of cigarettes to a vaping device. It's a little bit of a hit and miss. The good thing is you can have to tell the person to titrate and learn over the first few weeks. We know that in studies as well, that people who get instructions on how to vape tend to take it up better and then hold on to it better. So it's helping make sure that they understand how to substitute and transition from cigarettes to that. Is we don't have any standardized products that we can show to, tell them to. Like we can do with a lozenge or a gum, where we say, okay, roughly one lozenge is equivalent to one cigarette. We don't have that luxury right now. And so there's a great question: is 20 milligrams max pod? Will people decrease the intake if we go to 20 milligrams max pod, or do you think they will go through more pods? Compensation is always an issue. I mean, this is what happened when we compensate, when light and mild cigarettes came, people compensated. If you look at other addictions where compensation doesn't occur, is actually with light beer, because you can't, after a certain point, you can't drink more light beer because your bladder basically makes you stop. With inhalation, unfortunately, it is possible that people could compensate by just going through more, but other factors may help people not do that, because one, cost will come into play, and they may also, if they are instructed appropriately, that they restrict their use to only, they're not grazing through the day and they're not just running through this all day and all night. They may not make that compensation, because they may recognize that they are getting satisfactory experiences with just a few puffs, and don't necessarily need to complete, like with a cigarette, complete the whole thing or have a whole 20-minute session where they're vaping. they may find themselves comfortable with 2 or 3 puffs and then can stop and go on. So those are the kinds of things. I think I'm not sure about propylene glycol being oily. My sense is that the vegetable glycerin and propylene glycol together and this may also explain in some of the reasons where in some cases of the evaluation they have not been able to find cannabis or THC or vitamin X acetate, and it's only vaping. So it is possible there may be some people with aerosolizing some of that may be having that reaction, but I can't be 100% sure about that. I'm gonna just given that we're at 1 o'clock, we're gonna collect all the questions and we're gonna figure out a ways to get back to you and share it to the group and to the people who registered, and feel free to share this with others. So I want to thank everybody for your questions and for participating and hanging on to the end. So have a great rest of the day and all the best, and stay safe and stay well.
Thanks so much, Peter, for your great recorded presentation and answers to the questions. So just reminding everyone, we will be sending along a recording of today's presentation, as well as a copy of the slides. Additionally, by the end of today, tomorrow, we will be sharing the post-learning assessment and evaluation surveys if you're interested in receiving a letter of completion. We thank you all so much for bearing with our technical difficulties today and really appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much, everyone.